They laughed at his mail-order rifle until 8 enemy planes fell in 3 minutes. June 1943. An Allied forward airstrip in North Africa. The airfield sat exposed against the desert, a flat stretch of packed sand and pierced steel runway plates, surrounded by low berms and sparse defensive positions. Heat had already begun to rise from the ground, even though it was still morning. The sky was clear, offering no cover, good for flying, dangerous for anything on the ground. Fighter aircraft were parked in long, orderly rows. Their engines were silent, canopies open, maintenance panels removed. Ground crews worked steadily, performing routine inspections, refueling, and minor repairs. Pilots waited nearby, checking maps or sitting in the shade of canvas tents, helmets resting beside them. Everyone knew their role. Everyone knew the routine. This airfield had one purpose: to keep aircraft flying. Every man stationed there supported that goal, directly or indirectly. The pilots flew combat missions, mechanics kept the planes operational, armorers loaded weapons, guards watched the perimeter. Corporal Daniel Mercer was one of those guards. Mercer was 27 years old and assigned to airfield defense. His task was simple but critical. He was responsible for observing the surrounding terrain, reporting incoming threats, and supporting defensive fire if the airfield was attacked. He was not part of a dedicated anti-aircraft unit. He did not operate heavy weapons. He was trained with a standard service rifle and expected to respond as needed. Before the war, Mercer had grown up in rural Pennsylvania. He had worked on farms, hunted regularly, and handled firearms from a young age. He was familiar with distance, movement, and timing. When he enlisted, those skills did not set him apart. Many soldiers had similar backgrounds. Mercer was quiet, reliable, and rarely noticed. That morning, a supply truck arrived shortly after 900 hours. The truck carried ammunition, rations, spare equipment, ordinary deliveries. As it reversed toward the unloading area, several men gathered to help offload the cargo. Crates were pushed down the ramp, marked clearly with military stencils. Then one crate stood out. It was long and narrow, roughly built with civilian shipping labels still attached. Dust covered the wood. There were no military markings. A mechanic noticed it first and stopped. Someone left. Another man asked who had ordered it. Mercer stepped forward without responding. He knelt beside the crate and began removing the nails with deliberate movements. When the lid came free, the contents became visible. Inside was a bolt-action rifle with a wooden stock and blued steel barrel. It was clean, well-made, and unmistakably civilian. A mail-order rifle, the kind that could be purchased through a catalog and delivered in a wooden crate. The reaction was immediate. Several men laughed openly, others shook their heads. One mechanic made a comment about hunting animals. Another joked that Mercer would need better luck than skill if he planned to use it in combat. An officer nearby glanced over briefly. He said nothing, but his expression showed clear doubt. The airfield already had mounted machine guns and light anti-aircraft weapons. A civilian rifle had no obvious place in the defensive plan. Mercer lifted the rifle from the crate. He checked the bolt, inspected the chamber, and tested the action. He handled it with familiarity, not as a novelty. He did not respond to the comments. He did not explain himself. Mercer was there for a reason. In previous weeks, the airfield had come under low-level air attack. Enemy fighters had approached at high speed, descended quickly, and conducted strafing runs against parked aircraft and fuel storage. The attacks were brief but effective. Anti-aircraft guns often engaged too late. Machine gun crews focused on suppressing fire rather than precise targeting. Mercer had noticed something during those attacks. The enemy aircraft flew lower than expected. Pilots committed to their attack runs. For a short moment, cockpits and engine intakes were clearly visible from the ground. Mercer had ordered the rifle using his own pay. It was legal, available, and reliable. He did not modify it. He practiced range estimation, timing, and target tracking during quiet hours. He was not trying to replace anti-aircraft weapons. He was preparing for a moment when nothing else might be positioned correctly. When the laughter faded, the men returned to their tasks. The crate was pushed aside. The rifle was dismissed as irrelevant. Mercer remained near the perimeter. He leaned the rifle against a sandbagged position and scanned the sky. His duty was to observe and report. If an attack came, his responsibility was to respond with whatever tools were available to him. He did not expect recognition. He did not expect approval. He expected another attack, and he intended to be ready when it came. Weeks before the attack, life on the airfield settled into a pattern that felt almost predictable. Missions launched at dawn and returned by late afternoon. Maintenance crews worked through heat and dust, replacing worn parts and patching damage from earlier sorties. Guards rotated positions along the perimeter, scanning empty desert and memorizing shapes that never changed. Corporal Daniel Mercer remained at his post, day after day. His assignment kept him away from the center of the airfield. He was stationed near the outer berms, where sandbags formed low firing positions and observation points. His primary task was early warning. If aircraft appeared on the horizon, he was expected to identify direction, altitude, and speed, then relay that information immediately. If the airfield was attacked, he was to assist however he could until heavier defenses engaged. Most days passed without incident. During those quiet hours, Mercer watched carefully. He studied how pilots took off and landed. He observed how ground crews reacted to alerts. He paid attention to where machine gun crews set up and how quickly anti-aircraft teams could bring their weapons to bear. He also trained on his own. Early in the mornings, before the heat became unbearable, Mercer lay prone behind the sandbags with his rifle. He practiced sight alignment and trigger control. He estimated distances to landmarks around the airfield, fuel drums, tents, vehicles, antenna poles. He timed how long it took an object moving at speed to cross his field of view. He did not fire often. Ammunition was limited and he did not want attention. Most of his preparation happened in his head. Other soldiers noticed but did not interfere. Some shook their heads. Others ignored him entirely. To them, Mercer was simply filling time. Occasionally, someone commented, "You really think that thing's going to help if they come back?" Mercer answered calmly when he answered at all. "They fly low." That was usually the end of the conversation. What Mercer did not say was that he had seen fear in the enemy pilot's behavior. During previous attacks, when the first bursts of fire came up from the ground, the pilots hesitated. They adjusted late. They committed fully to their runs, trusting speed and surprise more than altitude. Mercer believed that hesitation mattered. He was not trying to challenge modern aircraft. He was preparing for a narrow window, seconds, maybe less, when a pilot's attention was fixed forward, when evasive movement was minimal, and when a single well-placed shot could have consequences. The officers focused on broader concerns. Intelligence reports warned of increased enemy activity in the region. Nearby airfields had been attacked repeatedly. Defensive plans were reviewed and adjusted. Machine gun crews drilled. Ammunition was redistributed. No one revised the plan to include a man with a rifle. Mercer understood his place. He was not part of strategy meetings. He was not expected to influence outcomes. His role was limited, clearly defined, and easily overlooked. That did not bother him. On the evening before the attack, the airfield was unusually quiet. The sky darkened quickly, and a warm wind carried sand across the runway. Mercer sat cleaning his rifle under a dim light, wiping the bolt and checking the sights. Nearby, another guard smoked and listened to the distant sound of aircraft engines returning from patrol. There was no sense of urgency, no alarm, no warning, but Mercer felt it. He had learned to trust small signs, the way pilots lingered near their aircraft, the way officers checked the sky more often than usual, the way radio traffic increased slightly without explanation. When he lay down to rest that night, the rifle was within arm's reach. He did not sleep deeply. He knew that when the next attack came, it would happen fast, and when it did, there would be no time to argue about whether a mail-order rifle belonged on a wartime airfield. There would only be time to act. The warning came late. Shortly before midday, the heat had settled heavily over the airfield. The sky remained clear, almost empty, and visibility stretched for miles in every direction. Aircraft were parked and vulnerable, engines cooling after the morning sorties. Mechanics worked without urgency, guards maintained their posts, eyes drifting across the horizon, out of habit rather than expectation. Daniel Mercer was facing east when he noticed it. At first it was only movement, small, dark points against the pale sky, too low, too fast. Not friendly. Mercer raised his binoculars and felt his posture change immediately. The aircraft were approaching at low altitude, scheming just above the desert floor, using speed and terrain to stay beneath early detection. It was a familiar pattern. He had seen it before. He did not hesitate. Mercer turned and ran toward the nearest field telephone, his boots kicking up dust as he moved. He reported what he saw, clearly and concisely: number of aircraft, direction of approach, altitude. His voice remained steady. There was no panic in it. Within seconds, the siren began to sound. The airfield reacted in fragments rather than as a single unit. Pilots moved toward cover. Mechanics abandoned tools and scattered. Machine gun crews rushed to their positions, dragging ammunition boxes behind them. Anti-aircraft teams struggled to bring weapons to bear on targets that were already too low and closing fast. Mercer returned to his sandbagged position. The rifle was where he had left it. He dropped to the ground, pressed the stock into his shoulder, and watched the aircraft grow larger. He could hear the engines now, distinct, aggressive, uneven, as the pilots adjusted throttle for their attack runs. The first aircraft broke formation and descended even lower, lining up with the parked fighters. Its wings rocked slightly as the pilot committed to the approach. The cockpit canopy caught the sun for a brief moment. Mercer tracked it smoothly. Someone shouted behind him, telling him to get down, to leave it to the guns. He did not turn. He did not answer. He waited. The distance closed rapidly. The aircraft was no longer a shape, it was a machine, a cockpit, a pilot leaning forward, focused entirely on the target ahead. Mercer exhaled and fired. The sound of the rifle was sharp and clean, nearly lost among the rising noise of engines and sirens. The bolt cycled smoothly as Mercer chambered another round without looking. The aircraft jolted violently. It veered off its line, trailing smoke, and disappeared beyond the edge of the airfield. No one immediately understood what had happened. The machine gun crews continued firing. Tracers streaked upward, the sky filled with noise and movement. Mercer stayed focused. Another aircraft followed the same path. Another pilot flew too low, too straight, trusting speed and surprise to carry him through. Mercer adjusted slightly and fired again. This time the effect was unmistakable. The aircraft rolled sharply, lost altitude, and struck the ground in a plume of dust and flame just beyond the perimeter. Shouts erupted behind him. Someone swore loudly. Another voice asked what was happening. Mercer did not stop. The attacking formation began to break apart. Pilots pulled up too late or jinked wildly, trying to escape a threat they did not understand. In their confusion, they exposed themselves even more. Mercer fired again and again. He worked the bolt with practiced efficiency, each movement controlled, deliberate. He did not rush. He did not fire unless the sight picture was clear. He aimed for cockpits, engine intakes, control areas, targets that mattered at close range. Within minutes, the sky above the airfield was chaos. Aircraft fell out of formation. Some crashed immediately. Others limped away, trailing smoke, disappearing toward the horizon only to go down moments later, beyond sight. Machine gun fire and flak filled the air, but the damage had already been done. When the last enemy aircraft turned away, silence followed abruptly. Smoke drifted across the runway. The siren cut off. Men slowly emerged from cover, looking upward, then toward the desert beyond the airfield. Someone counted aloud. No one laughed. Mercer lowered the rifle and remained where he was, breathing steadily, eyes still scanning the sky in case the attack resumed. It did not. In less than 3 minutes, the airfield had survived an assault that should have crippled it. And no one could ignore what had just happened. The firing stopped almost as suddenly as it had begun. For several seconds, no one moved. Smoke hung low over the runway, drifting across parked aircraft and abandoned equipment. The smell of fuel and burnt metal mixed with the dry desert air. Tracer fire faded from the sky, leaving only the distant echo of engines retreating toward the horizon. Men slowly rose from behind sandbags and vehicles. Some looked upward, expecting another pass. Others stared toward the desert beyond the perimeter, trying to understand what they had just seen. Daniel Mercer remained in position. He stayed prone, rifle still aligned toward the direction of the attack. His training told him not to assume it was over. Enemy pilots sometimes turned back. A second wave was always possible. Behind him, voices grew louder. A machine gun crew argued about how many aircraft had gone down. A mechanic pointed toward a distant column of smoke rising beyond the berm. Someone asked who had been firing single shots during the attack. An officer approached carefully, scanning the sky as he walked. He stopped a few meters from Mercer and looked down at the rifle. "Corporal," he said evenly, "did you fire that weapon?" Mercer answered without hesitation, "Yes, sir." "How many times?" Mercer paused, thinking back through the sequence. 8 confirmed shots, possibly more damage beyond that. The officer looked past Mercer toward the desert. He said nothing at first. Other men gathered nearby. The mood was no longer mocking or dismissive. It was unsettled. Several soldiers glanced at the rifle, then at the distant smoke, then back again. The mechanic spoke quietly. "I watched one of them go straight in. That wasn't flak." Another man added that he had seen a pilot lose control immediately after a single sharp crack separate from the machine gun fire. The officer knelt and examined the rifle more closely. He checked the sights, the bolt, the spent casings lying in the sand. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "Mail order, sir." That answer drew a few short, disbelieving looks, but no laughter. The officer stood and called for a runner. Within minutes, intelligence personnel and senior staff arrived. Questions were asked quickly and precisely. Mercer repeated his account calmly. He explained where he aimed and why. He described the approach angles he had observed during earlier attacks. No one interrupted him. What had happened could not be ignored, but it also could not be easily explained. Official doctrine did not account for rifle fire being effective against aircraft. Reports would have to be written carefully. The intelligence officer made notes and spoke in a low voice to the commanding officer. Phrases like combined defensive fire and low-altitude engagement were repeated. Mercer was told to remain available for further questioning. The rifle was taken for examination. Not confiscated, not dismissed, simply removed from the scene and carried away by men who handled it with new care. As the airfield returned to controlled activity, damaged equipment was assessed and aircraft repositioned. Engineers marked impact points. Guards resumed their posts. The war continued, indifferent to what had nearly been lost. Mercer returned to duty. He was not congratulated. There was no ceremony, no announcement. The men around him treated him differently now. Not with admiration, but with quiet respect and caution, as if they had witnessed something that did not fit neatly into their understanding of the war. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the desert and the heat finally eased, Mercer stood watch again at the perimeter. The sky was empty, but no one laughed at the rifle anymore. In the days that followed, the airfield returned to its routine on the surface, but something had changed beneath it. Reports were written and rewritten, times were adjusted, language was softened. The attack was officially recorded as having been repelled by coordinated ground defenses. Individual actions were folded into collective descriptions. No single weapon, no single man was emphasized. Daniel Mercer was questioned twice more. Each time, the process was formal and restrained. Intelligence officers asked about his background, his training, his decision to acquire the rifle. They asked how long he had been preparing, what he had observed during previous attacks, why he believed rifle fire could be effective against aircraft. Mercer answered carefully and without exaggeration. He explained that he had grown up handling firearms, that he understood distance and movement, that he had noticed enemy pilots flying lower with each raid, relying on speed rather than altitude, that he believed there was a narrow window during a strafing run when a pilot was fully committed and vulnerable. No one challenged his account, but no one endorsed it openly either. The rifle was returned to him 2 days later, cleaned, inspected, unmodified. There were no instructions attached, no new orders. It was as if the Army acknowledged the weapon without knowing what to do with the fact that it had worked. Among the enlisted men, the tone shifted quietly. The mechanics no longer joked when Mercer passed. Guards asked him questions in low voices about lead, about aim, about whether he really thought it could happen again. Mercer answered when it mattered and stayed silent when it didn't. One evening, a young private approached him while he cleaned the rifle near the perimeter. "My brother flies," the private said. "He says they're told ground fire can't touch them if they stay fast." Mercer nodded. "They're told a lot of things," he replied. The airfield remained active, sorties increased, enemy aircraft stayed higher in subsequent encounters, attacks became less frequent and less aggressive. No one officially connected that change to what had happened. But the pattern was noticed. An older sergeant who had seen campaigns rise and fall summed it up quietly one night. "They learned something out there," he said. "Same as we did." Mercer received no medal. His name did not appear in any after-action summary. He remained a corporal, performing the same duties he had before. He continued to watch the horizon, report contacts, and prepare in silence. The war moved forward, consuming attention and memory alike. New battles demanded new stories. What had happened on that airstrip became just another moment absorbed into the larger chaos. But among the men who had been there, the memory stayed sharp. They remembered the sound of single shots cutting through the noise. They remembered the way aircraft fell unexpectedly. They remembered how laughter had stopped all at once. And they remembered the quiet guard at the perimeter who had done his job when it mattered most. Years later, the war was described in numbers, maps, and major operations. Air campaigns were measured in tonnage dropped and aircraft lost. Ground battles were reduced to arrows moving across paper. The small moments that did not fit into official categories rarely survived that process. What happened on that North African airstrip became one of those moments. There was no file dedicated to it, no formal citation. The after-action reports mentioned an enemy attack repelled, losses inflicted, minimal damage sustained, nothing more. The details dissolved into general language, indistinguishable from countless other engagements across the theater. Daniel Mercer did not speak about it after the war. When his service ended, he returned home without fanfare. He found work that required patience and attention, skills he already had. To those around him, he was an ordinary man who rarely talked about his time overseas. If asked, he answered briefly and changed the subject. But history does not depend solely on records. Across multiple wars, pilots had been lost to ground fire that was never meant to reach them. Rifles, pistols, and improvised weapons had found their mark during moments of overconfidence and miscalculation. These incidents rarely altered strategy, but they changed individuals, both those who fired and those who survived. Mercer's experience belonged to that pattern. He had not defeated the enemy alone. He had not replaced modern weapons or rewritten doctrine. What he had done was recognize a weakness and act within it when the moment appeared. That mattered. For the men on that airfield, the lesson was immediate and lasting. Technology did not eliminate vulnerability. Speed did not guarantee safety. Underestimating the ground was a mistake pilots only made once. The rifle itself did not become famous. It was not preserved in a museum or displayed as a symbol. It remained what it had always been. A simple tool, effective only in the hands of someone who understood its limits and its possibilities. The laughter that greeted it never returned. In war, respect is often granted too late and withdrawn too slowly. The line between ridicule and survival is thin, and it is crossed in moments that history rarely pauses to record. What endured was not the weapon, but the reminder that preparation matters, that observation matters, that ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances can influence events without ever being recognized for it. Sometimes, history turns not on grand plans or famous machines, but on a single decision made quietly by someone everyone else ignored. And sometimes that is enough.